All right, hi everybody. My name is Osama bin Lama. I'm one of the XOs here in NOCAP. This is the first of what I hope will be many quick naval history lunch and learns to add some flavor and some understanding about this game that we all enjoy playing. I want to tell you this is intended to be quick. And by quick, I mean about a half hour, 45 minutes. It's intended for people who are moderately familiar with naval history, naval ships, naval tactics. But that being said, we will have some opportunities to ask questions in the middle of the presentation and at the end. So if there's anything you don't understand, take a note. Feel free to ask about it when the opportunity for questions arise. IronDuke, our very own IronDuke, his CV has been mentioned in the announcements, so I won't go over it because it is long and it is impressive. He is not just an enthusiast, he is a professional when it comes to knowledge of naval history. He loves to tell stories, and that's how we came upon him in putting this whole plan together. He enjoys telling stories. He's a deep well of knowledge, and it would be silly for us not to try to funnel that into something that can bring some additional enjoyment to our game. So I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to turn this over to IronDuke, and if there are any questions, please ping me directly on Discord so that we don't interrupt the presentation. Please mute yourselves, and IronDuke, please take it away.
Thanks, Lama. And just putting you on notice right now, I'm never doing this again, ever. This was a bait and switch, and yeah. Let's just I'm not going to regurgitate everything I've done in my life, but the important thing for everybody here to understand is that we're all pixel boat nerds. We all enjoy the game. And what it brings, I mean, many of the ships in the game never got to see that much action. So, in being able to play this game, we get to see the ships as what we would hope they would have been. And to be honest with you, I'm just a nerd, and I was lucky enough that the Navy and the GI Bill was able to pay for me to become an even bigger nerd. So I find myself in good company with everybody who's joined in today, and I'm taking it for granted that you guys are just as big nerds as I am. So thank you for the opportunity. And the big thing is that the Battle of the Komandorski Islands. Why are we learning about this battle, and why does it have such a long name, and why is it important? Well, rest assured, if they could have named it anything else, they would have, because Komandorski doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But this was the last multi-hour daylight surface fight between surface combatants in history. There were no subs, and the only role aircraft had, I'll get into a little bit more, but they really did nothing else except crash and get shot at. So next slide, please. All right, just to give you a quick update on where the Japanese was when this battle took place, we're talking about March 1943. The Japanese had already taken the islands of Attu and Kiska far, far up north, and it was generally seen by the Japanese Fifth Fleet as a backwater. It was not where they sent their most prized units, but at the same token, the Americans saw it the exact same way. We weren't sending new ships, we weren't sending new commands. We were trying to pretty much hold the line while we figured out exactly what we were going to do about this incursion on North American soil, because the Japanese made no shortage, and the American press made no shortage of press material stating, hey, North America has been invaded. We have the enemy on North America. Yeah, technically you're in North America, but as the Japanese rapidly realized once they arrived on Attu and Kiska, yeah, those islands are only about as they could only help you out if a major war aim of yours was to go on a narwhal hunt. It is cold, it is bleak, it is a godforsaken land, and there is nothing there that could really put up with a large garrison or provided as a jumping off point for a invasion of, say, Kodiak or the rest of mainland Alaska. Some propaganda was made to that effect, but no, it really wasn't. But I'll go more into detail in a little bit. Next slide, please. So this is the Aleutians. We have Attu and Kiska. Again, as far as cold as bleak, Attu and Kiska were invaded on the 6th and 7th of June, respectively, and the main American bases can be found on Adak, Unalaska, and Kodiak. Kodiak is that large island to the east, while Lama is circling Unalaska, which is where Dutch Harbor is. And that was the main focal point and the main area of attack when the Japanese arrived during their operation. When the Japanese invaded, the only American presence on Kiska was a 10-man Navy weather station. And on Attu, they found 3 Caucasians and actually killed one of them. So it was more or less an unopposed landing. It was unexpected on our part, but once they were there, and it was up to the Americans to figure out exactly what to do about it. So why would people want to be fighting over this godforsaken land in the first place? Well, setting the stage right now, the Japanese are in Attu, the Japanese are in Kiska, the Americans are further along the island chain in Adak, Unalaska, and Kodiak. So as it stood right now, they were trying to figure out what to do with each other. So let's introduce the key players in the Battle of the Komandorskis. Next slide, please. So the main adversaries on the right-hand side, we have Rear Admiral Charles Horatio McMorris. With such a distinguished name such as that, you would have to have a nickname, and his nickname was Socrates because in Annapolis, I guess he proved that he was very witty, he had a good memory, and he could pretty much put any book to memory if he gave it his best shot. He finished 5th in his class, and somewhat special for an American admiral, he did see World War I combat service in destroyers. As we were talking about March 1943, the war had been raging for quite some time, and he had already distinguished himself as well in the Battle of Cape Esperance when he was on board the Salt Lake City. And him and his ship traded shots with the Japanese Navy cruiser Kinugasa, which was an Aoba class. If you look at his medals rack right there, you see at the very top, he's wearing the Navy Cross, which is the second highest award for bravery, only underneath the Medal of Honor. And again, he earned that during the Battle of Cape Esperance. On the left-hand side, you see Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya. You could not picture a more different person from Sock McMorris than anybody else. Admiral Hosogaya was a peacetime captain with a ton of administrative duty. He was previously commandant of both the Japanese Communication School and their torpedo schools. In July 1941, he became the SINC of the 5th Fleet for the North Pacific Forces and actually led the invasion of Attu and Kiska. But again, the 5th Fleet was seen as a backwater. Most capable Japanese forces were down south assisting for everything going on down there, such as Coral Sea, Guadalcanal. I mean, it was a very, very busy time in the South Pacific. So they weren't exactly going to be sending either their best combat units nor their most tried and true combat leaders. But up until this point, Vice Admiral Hosogaya had led the invasion quite well, and he had previously led 4 supply convoys to both Attu and Kiska, ensuring that the troops there were well supplied. Next slide, please. So here's the order of battle, and I kind of set it up so that we could kind of put World of Warships in context with the classes of the ships next to their actual names. So you'll see right away just about every single ship that took part in this battle is represented in World of Warships. Salt Lake City was the guns of what was going to be the American fleet, while the Japanese had 2 heavy cruisers to their name. Next slide, please. So with the Americans, you have what was called Task Force Mike. It was built around the USS Salt Lake City. She was an old warhorse, an emphasis on old. Commissioned in 1927, she had seen extensive peacetime service, but more importantly, she had also seen active combat service since the beginning of the war. Having been bloodied in Cape Esperance, she went into the yard for an extensive yard period. And as many of us in the military know, the second you go back to your main base, there's turnover. So by the time the Salt Lake City became part of Task Force Mike, about 70% of her crew was new and had never been to sea before. On the right-hand side, we see USS Richmond, which was a Omaha class cruiser. At this stage in the war, they had removed the rearmost 6-inch casemate mounts. They still had one, but the closest one to the water they had to remove. It got a little too wet. So she was capable of firing a 7-gun broadside as opposed to 8. But the big thing with the Omahas was that they were the first cruisers or any combatant really to incorporate a turret for a gun as small as 6 inches. During World War One, pre-war, I mean, look at the Olympia. You saw plenty of turrets for the larger guns, the 8-inch guns, the 10-inch guns, 12, so on and so forth. With the 7-inch, 6-inch guns, you saw them a lot of times, as kind of what you see on the Omaha, in either casemates or in single mounts. The Omahas were the first one to really have a turret, which enabled a much faster rate of fire. The big thing to remember here with Task Force Mike is that these were not prime combatants. The U.S. did their very best to keep the Omahas out of direct confrontation. When we were hurting very, very hard for light cruisers anywhere after the first Battle of Savo Island and during the Guadalcanal campaign, it says a lot that we would be more than willing to throw Atlantas into a fray, but we weren't going to send an Omaha. And that was pretty much because the U.S. Navy had the luxury to do so. There were plenty of other places where the Omahas could be useful, and we did our best to make sure that they could do that without them getting blown out of the water. The Salt Lake City, being a Pensacola class, when they were first commissioned, they were considered light cruisers simply because their armor was that light. It was only after we started designating heavy and light cruisers by the caliber of the shell that they fired that she was classified as a heavy cruiser. Now, the big thing to notice with the Pensacola class in general, Lama, if you can help me out here, is that with the Pensacola's, you have 4 gun turrets, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The gun turrets for turrets 1 and turret 4, the 2 gun turrets, turrets 2 and 3 have the 3 gun turrets. This goes against all shipbuilding rules and norms, but you want to have the heaviest things closest to the water. And a 3-gun turret weighs a hell of a lot more than a 2-gun turret. So as a result, the Pensacola's could be quite a bit top heavy and prone to rolling. And if any of you guys have seen The Deadliest Catch or Coast Guard Alaska or anything like that, the waters of the Bering Sea and the North Pacific are terrible. And if your ship was prone to rolling before then, it was definitely going to be rocking and rolling then. But the reason why they did this with the Pensacola's was because the beam narrowed such into the bow that they could not physically put a 3-gun turret where they wanted it. They had to put it where they had space, and unfortunately that was directly above a 2-gun turret. So yeah, topside weight was definitely seen as a no-no for the Picola. So when you see pictures of them later in the war, they don't have half as much radar mass and antennas and all sorts of stuff that they would stick on top of like the New Orleans and the Baltimores and such. Next slide, please. So the Japanese Fifth Fleet. Well, I was talking about the American cruisers being cold, with Salt Lake City being 7 and Omaha being 1921 when she was commissioned. Well, the Japanese really couldn't hold a candle to that because the Maya on the left was commissioned in 1928, beating Salt Lake City by only a year, and the Nachi was commissioned in 1924. So these, in and of themselves were somewhat older ships. However, the Takao class did get regunned, and their superstructure was extensively modified when they were swapping them over from 6-inch guns to 8-inch guns. Likewise, the rest of the fleet was made up of very old ships, such as the two light cruisers that accompanied them were both of early 1920s vintage, and the DDs that came with the Japanese fleet were also quite old, of early 30s vintage. Next slide, please. So when you look at the stats of the battle, immediately that the Americans are undergunned, and they are, because on the face of it, we have one heavy cruiser and one light cruiser. We got a Piccola and we got an Omaha. The Japanese, they had a Miyoko, a Takao, and then they had two light cruisers. Now, when the Japanese were talking about light cruisers, they really did mean light. The whole point of a light cruiser in Japanese doctrine was to escort the DDs and scout for the fleet. And the Americans, to be fair, had the exact same ideas when they were designing the Omahas. However, the Omahas were armed to the teeth with 6-inch guns. They could go just as fast as any DD, but we progressed, and by we, I mean the US Navy progressed beyond that in our design. We decided to make our light cruisers uh, not just dependent on destroyers and scouting, but expected them to fight in their own right. All you have to do is look at the Brooklyn class, and where you're mounting 15 6-inch guns. No, the Japanese, they expected their light cruisers to be comfortable accommodations for the commodores of DD fleets. You can see this right here. This is taken from an Office of Naval Intelligence printout meant for identification in the fleet. It's incorrectly labeled the Notori class. What they meant was it's the Nagara class. And to give you an idea, the Nagara was actually serving as an escort to the 4 aircraft carriers at Butai when they attacked Midway. And when those first 3 carriers were sunk, the Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi were sinking, it was on the Nagara that Admiral Nagumo hoisted his flag, simply because these light cruisers were meant to be flagships. Obviously, they were not big on gunpowder. They expected them to back up the DDs and to potentially contribute, some way, somehow. But with 7 5.5-inch guns, you weren't doing much. And that was actually one of the more heavily armed Japanese light cruisers. You had the Tenryus and the Kumas. Kumas had 7, but the Tenryus, by the time they saw World War II service, only had 4 guns. And you're thinking to yourself, hold on, these ships were designed in 1918, 1919. The Americans were freaking out that of even the potential of a 1921 vintage Omaha seeing active combat. What gives? Why were the Japanese not similarly concerned? Well, the Japanese really didn't have a choice. They pretty much quit making light cruisers after 1925. I mean, there was nothing light cruiser launched since the Sendai of 1925 and the first Aganos, which was Agano was launched in 1941. And just to give you some perspective, the Yahagi, which was a Anago class, was the light cruiser during Operation Tengo for the last battle with the Yamato. So they spent quite a bit of time uh, resting on their laurels, so to speak. However, the thing to remember is that these light cruisers could be oversized destroyers, and oftentimes that's how they're employed. During the first Battle of Savo Island, the Tenryu herself, probably the oldest cruiser, I mean, I may be wrong, she was probably the oldest cruiser in service in the world at that time, launched torpedoes that sunk the USS Vincennes, which was a New Orleans class. So if you think of it in terms of World of Warships, a Tier 3 just got into range and torped the ever-living hell out of a Tier 7. So they could be dangerous with their torpedoes, but at the same play, we did not, the American-Japanese naval doctrine did not see light cruisers the same. Next slide, please. So, the invasion of the Aleutians. On the left, you see the bombardment of Dutch Harbor in Unalaska, which was launched by not one but two Japanese aircraft, Junyo and the Ryujo. And on the right-hand side, you see the Japanese soldiers landing on Kiska and probably trying to figure out what to do now. Why the Aleutians? It's a question a lot of people have asked themselves, and historians have generally just glazed over it, saying that it was meant to be a diversion from the Midway campaign. Because these two campaigns, the invasion of the Aleutians and the attack and battle of Midway, both happened at the same time. So the Americans had a hard time trying to figure out why you would take two aircraft carriers as well as valuable surface units away from what was going to be the focus of the battle, the Battle of Midway. But in reality, this was an entirely separate operation that happened simultaneously with the Battle of Midway. In return for Japanese naval HQs agreeing to Admiral Yamamoto's plans to attack Midway, they forced him to adopt a plan that their naval staff had been kicking around for a long time. Because in reality, after their unbridled success in the first year of the war, they had to come to a conclusion like, where are we going to go now? Are we going to Fiji? Are we going to go to Haiti? Are we going to continue concentrating south and perhaps Australia? And they were just trying to sort of figure out exactly where to go. And luckily for them, and luckily for us, the Doolittle raid kind of focused them to push their defensive perimeters further away from the home islands. Midway was sort of meant to do this, as well as the Aleutians. Um, some people might argue with me because the history books have for so long pushed that this was a diversionary attack meant to take the American fleet away from Midway so that Admiral Nagumo could have their way with them. But that just doesn't hold up to logic. Um, truth be told, Japanese primary sources and interviews with surviving admirals attest to the fact that either these were simultaneous events, or if they're talking about Midway, they don't even mention the Aleutians. And if you're talking about Midway, you would probably want to be talking about such a massive diversionary effort. And for a diversion to have worked, the Aleutians attack would have had to have taken place many days before, because the Japanese were assuming that the American fleet would need to take the bait to leave Pearl Harbor. But if you want the American fleet to leave Pearl Harbor and go somewhere else, ideally you would want to give them enough time to sortie and go to that somewhere else you want them to be. The whole point of Admiral Yamamoto's attack on Midway was to draw out the American fleet and destroy it. Therefore, he probably had no will to have the American fleet anywhere else besides under the guns of the Yamato, the Nagato, and his four aircraft carriers that were waiting for him off of Midway. So, put simply, the Aleutians campaign was just an opportunistic land grab done while, Nimitz was busy with other priorities. Pushing their defensive perimeter further out, yeah, it helped, and they wanted to do that, but the weather was terrible. You couldn't eat anything on those islands. You had no wood to build anything on those islands. And in the end, it drew away valuable forces that Yamamoto could have definitely have put better use at Midway. So next slide, please.
Do we want to, since we've set the stage, this is a good opportunity if there are some quick questions, if there's anything that we want to ask about the ships involved or the context of the battle. Are there any questions anybody has?
All right.
If anyone's asking, it's because you're muted. Just checking. The mute button is a powerful deterrent. All right. Excellently explained. Nothing left to the imagination. All right, moving on.
Okay, so the stage is set. The Japanese are in Kiska for supply runs delivered to them. And Task Force Mike and Sock McMorris was determined to make sure that they weren't going to do that anymore. This chart that you're looking at is wrong, actually, because there was no way that the Americans had their ships in a line over 30 miles across. In reality, it was a search line that was 6 miles long altogether. There was 1 mile of separation from each ship. We had all the ships here did have radar, some better than others, but at approximately 7:30, both the Cochrane and the Richmond picked up 2 blips on their radar. The Richmond was serving as a flagship. Sock McMorris was on board the Richmond, not the Salt Lake City. So he saw this is exactly what I want. I got a fast force that can take out any escorts that these hapless transports may have. And to hear him quote it, he thought that he was in store for a quote unquote Roman holiday, which was a very old term of art that I had never run across really, but it just means that he thought that he was going to be a fox in a hen house. He thought he was going to pretty much run wild and stop this convoy. So it is dawn on March 26th, and the whole point of this was to cut off the supplies running from Kiska and Attu, because you had probably 1,500 to 2,000 guys on Attu. You had 2,500 on Kiska. I mean, these guys aren't eating worms and grubs. They need supplies, and not only that, they needed construction materials, because if you're out in the elements and the Aleutians, you're not going to last long. So upon detecting these 2 ships, Sock McMorris calls his ships together. He wants to sort of focus and consolidate his forces. He doesn't want them scattered on a search line anymore. He already found what you're looking for. Now you need to get into a battle formation. So the first 3 ships slow down, and the second group of 3 ships, they speed up to consolidate the fleet. Now, the Richmond was armed with 14 6-inch and was more heavily armed than the others escorting him. But you have to remember, in the back of his head, he knew that the real firepower of his group lay in the 10 8-inch guns of the Salt Lake City. She had 6 months of repairs. She was new. She was in fighting trim, but a very new and raw crew and very little room for error. I mean, the surface temperature at the time that the fleet spotted each other was 34 degrees. So he turned north to intercept and started to consolidate his fleet. But at just about the exact same time, the Nachi, which was Admiral Hosagaya's flagship, made contact visually with the Americans and made the call that American warships are inbound fast. Hosagaya immediately ordered his 3 transports back and called forth his surface combatants to interpose them between the approaching Task Force Mike and the transports. And it was generally beginning to dawn on McMorris that he may have bitten off a little bit more than he can chew, because, yeah, radar blips are one thing, but when his lookouts started saying, cruiser sighted ahead, another cruiser sighted ahead, destroyers. I mean, yeah, this was not an unescorted convoy, and this was going to be a lot harder than he thought it was going to be. I mean, and even though the Japanese Fifth Fleet was the smallest of the Japanese numbered fleet, Task Force Mike had effectively just ran into all of them. And seeing the odds stacked against them, he had to make his decision. I mean, nothing can get you killed quicker in combat. I'm not speaking from experience, obviously, but you can't just sit there. You can't be indecisive. You need to do something and do it quick. And he decided he was going to fight. This wasn't a suicide run, but he thought that maybe he could make a feint one way and hit the transports by the other before the escorts could act. But the thing is that the Japanese ships were just as, if not faster than him. So the room for error was non-existent. Next slide, please. So the enemy's disposition. Once the fleets formed up on the left-hand side, you saw the Americans line right up and the Japanese heavy units interposing themselves. And thank you very much, Llama, for that picture. That picture actually is a really good one of the USS Dale and the, what was it, the Bailey? Oh, the Monahan.
That's the Dale in the
Monahan.
Dale in the rear and the Monahan in the front.
Yeah. So, yeah, we had the Bailey and the Coghlan in the front. They were both Benson class and the newest ships. Bailey was 1942, Coghlan was 1941, I believe. And then you got the Dale and Monahan, both of Farragut class, and they were commissioned in the mid 30s. So Nachi opens fire first at 8:38. So the two fleets spot each other at 7:30, and by the time they're through, by the time Hosagaya and Sock McMorris are through consolidating their fleets, making their opening moves, the first shot isn't fired until about an hour after they see each other and start maneuvering. So the Nachi opens fire on the Richmond from 18 kilometers away. Now, I forgot what the Miyoko's range was in game, but if you're a cruiser shooting at 18 kilometers away in the fierce, climate of the Aleutians, it is somewhat wishful thinking, but her aim was very, very good. Her second 10-gun salvo was close enough not only to splash the decks of the Richmond, but all the Omahas had 4 stacks, and one shell passed between funnels 3 and 4, cutting the guy wires that ran between them. So that was a reality check for Sock McMorris. He was in it for real. And so the Salt Lake City opens fire with her forward turrets, because as you can see, she was maneuvering somewhat to the northwest. And Nachi immediately switches fire to engage this larger target. But the Richmond sort of took this personally, I would like to think. And she opened up with fast and rapid 7-gun, 6-inch salvos, and actually hit the Nachi twice. The first time near the bridge, and the second time towards the front of the ship. It killed 13 and wounded 26 men. But more importantly, it killed the electrical power that was running the ammo hoist and the gun mounts for all 3 forward turrets of this Miyoko class cruiser. But at this stage, everybody is shooting at each other, meaning you have the heavy units of the Japanese, a combined 20 8-inch guns, and the CLs also start to join in at this point. So Sock McMorris orders his fleet to turn to the left, and Hosagaya continued to more or less pursue him. The problem with this move was that all of the American bases and all of the American territory lay to the east. And Adak Island was about 500 miles to the east at this point, but the closest of the Paramushiros in Japan was about 400 miles. So one way or another, he was effectively cut off from his bases at this point, but he did have to make this turn in order to effect not necessarily a fighting withdrawal, but just to kind of figure out what his next moves were going to be. And so he did what any good red-blooded American would do during this war. He requested air support. Now, mind you, this was 8:45, and the closest base that had an airfield on it was Adak, 500 miles away. And so he got a response to his request for air support, and they promised that it was going to arrive promptly at 2:30. Yeah, it was 8:45 right now, and he's in a daylight brawl with faster Japanese ships that apparently know how to shoot. It was at this stage that McMorris knew he had to, figure out exactly what his next stages were going to be, because he knew he was on his own. So at 9:10, about 25 minutes later, Nachi fixes power and promptly launches a spread of 8 torpedoes, but all of them missed. But in her constant movement to fire with her aft turrets and get good torpedo angles, she slowed down. So she's no longer leading Cow-class Maya leading the group. And the Maya gets its first hit on the Salt Lake City, killing 2 men, but no major damage is caused. Seeing that, she had a successful hit and wanting more, the Maya promptly launches a spotter plane to catch the fall of shell. This was a good idea. The weather wasn't too bad, and obviously the Americans were outnumbered. So the Maya wanted to do the very best it could to make its shots tell. But the first spotter plane ended up getting shot at by a lot of American anti-aircraft fire and dodged into the clouds to crash later in Kiska. So, seeing the fate of the first spotter plane, he decided that I need to launch another spotter plane. So, while both fleets are pretty much in a battle line, trading shots back and forth, just like the Battle of Trafalgar, more or less, the spotter plane gets lined up on the Maya, engines running, engines warming up. But if you look at the deck plan of the Takao class, at certain angles, the catapult equipment crosses over the turret angles. And so, with the spotter plane sitting on the catapult, a full 10 good broadside was not only sent towards the Americans, but it also ended up destroying the spotter plane while it sat on the catapult. The Americans did notice this and were very, very quick to claim it as an airplane kill. So, yeah, the Maya shot down her own spotter plane before it even got a chance to take off. So, the Salt Lake City and the Maya and the Nile blazing away at each distance is opened up enough to where the Richmond is out of range, as well as the four DDs with us. Really, the only combatants at this point that are in range of each other, and Sock McMorris is keeping it this way, is the Salt Lake City and the two Japanese heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya. So at 10:10 on the right-hand side, the Salt Lake City takes a bad hit. The hit went right through the main deck and exploded underneath the water line. But you have to keep in mind, the two fleets spotted each other at 7:30. They started trading shots with each other at 8:30, at 8:40 or 8:38, and it's only 10 minutes after 10 o'clock that the Salt Lake City takes its first like really bad hit. But this hit ruptured her oil tanks, caused the propeller shafts for 3 and 4 to begin flooding, and the after engine room was being sprayed with fuel oil. Now, if the air temperature is 34 degrees, the water temperature wasn't that much more, if not a little bit less. So the fuel oil immediately took on the consistency of tar, and it was nasty stuff. So her brand new crew was struggling mightily to not only bring her back to speed, fix the fuel oil leak, and get her moving again, because the Japanese were chasing them. They were faster than them, and they were going to catch up with them if they didn't keep their withdrawal going. And the Salt Lake City crew got it done. In fact, part of the fix involved wadding up clothing to stuff in the fuel oil tanks to stop the leak. But there was no hiding it now. The Americans were in trouble, and the Salt Lake City frantically signaled the Richmond and the 4DDs to start making smoke. We need cover. We got to, make it to where the Japanese can't aim at us very well. So obviously the Japanese were having no luck with spotting aircraft, and with the Americans decided to make smoke and make it even worse, Admiral Hosagaya ordered one of the light cruisers to actually do the job it was meant for and spot for the fleet. So you can see on the on the right-hand side, you got a light cruiser leading with the two heavy units following, while the Richmond is still leading the fleet more or less. She was making smoke, as well as all four DDs and the Salt Lake City. So the time is now 11 o'clock. The Japanese really have the Americans. They're cut off from their base. Their largest combatant is half crippled, and she's only able to shoot with her rear turrets. I mean, the Americans are going due south, so the Salt Lake City could only shoot with her rear turrets, and those were the only guns that the Americans had that were in range of, two Japanese heavy cruisers, two Japanese light cruisers, and four Japanese destroyers. So things are looking very bad, and it is at this time that there is another bad hit on the Salt Lake City. Next slide, please. So This hit on the Salt Lake City was below the waterline, and the Japanese shells were specifically designed to travel through the waterline, puncture below it, and penetrate for the guts. And that's exactly what happened. It burst the oil tanks again, and she immediately took on a 5-degree list as the water poured in. Her speed went down to 20 knots, and the Japanese are only moving closer. And it's at this point the crew, they've been doing a great job in ship going. In fact, she's not as maneuverable as she should have been because they were so zealous chasing the Japanese shell splashes that they carried away the stops to her rudder. And she was only able to make course changes in 10-degree increments. She can only go 10 degrees one way, 10 degrees the other. So not only is she wounded, but she can't maneuver. She's losing speed. She's got a list that's only getting worse, and water is pouring in. So the Salt Lake City crew, they're under no illusions. They got to work hard and they got to fix things fast. But in their haste to fix the fuel leak, they accidentally dumped salt water into a fuel line, which of course immediately killed all the burners in her boilers, and she comes to a stop. The picture on the right-hand side, it's a very popular picture. Chances are, if you just type in Battle of Komandorski Islands, you will see this picture. This is a picture of the Salt Lake City right before she came to a stop. You see all of her guns are trained to port, but in reality, it's only her aftermost turrets that can be shooting. But you can see vestiges of the smoke screen that's being laid by the Richmond that's in front of her, and the destroyers are scattered throughout. In fact, this picture was taken from one of our destroyers. Um, the worst thing in the middle of a fight you could ever hear transmitted to the Richmond from the Salt Lake City, and in effect, it just said "my speed 0." And this precipitated a real come to Jesus moment for the Americans. The Japanese are 17 kilometers away, closing fast, and at this stage, both sides have been shooting at each other for 2.5 hours. She's down to the last 15% of her ammo, and while she is hidden in her smoke, the Richmond is already asking the captain of the Salt Lake City if he wants to abandon ship. It was said later that the Japanese could have sunk the Salt Lake City with a baseball. The Salt Lake City says hell no, but they need time. They got to flush the fuel lines. They got to relight the boilers. They got to get steam up again. So, for those of you who may have studied the Battle of Jutland, something similar happens when a larger, more powerful surface combatant is crippled and needs time. What's the best way to do that? And the best way to do that is to send in the expendable assets to make a torpedo attack. And so on the left-hand side, you see the Dale standing by the Salt Lake City, continuing to lay smoke, the Richmond not that far away, but you can tell the Salt Lake City is more or less dead in the water. And so the Bailey, the Cochran, and the Monaghan charge the entire Japanese Fifth Fleet for all intents and purposes. 2 light cruisers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 4 Japanese DDs. Yeah, it was death-defying, and if I ever received an order like that, I'm sure their blood ran cold. But the largest ship in Task Force Mike was dead in the water. The flagship of Task Force Mike was standing by trying to assist the Salt Lake City. And this was really their only shot. Smoke wasn't going to last forever, and it was only a matter of time before it cleared. And they delivered the coup de grace to not only the Salt Lake City, but the rest of the American fleet. And in these cold waters, this far away from any part of civilization, don't fancy their chances. Next slide, please. The death rate of the DDs. And to be honest with you, there is one here that distinguishes itself during this phase of the battle, and this is the USS Bailey. She was tough as nails, and she closed to within 8 kilometers of that entire fleet to launch torpedoes at both the Maya and the Nachi. Before they charged, they had to realize, though, that this was 5,000 tons versus 50,000 tons. But the only orders that they got was targets are the heavies, and away they went. The Bailey missed all of her torpedoes, and the Cochran and the Monaghan fire torpedoes because the range was extreme to begin with. But soon after the Bailey launched her torpedo, she noticed that the Maya and the Nachi started to turn away, and they couldn't really understand why this was happening. But the Bailey couldn't understand why this was happening and immediately sent a signal to Sock McMorris saying, "Enemy is retiring to the west. Shall I follow them?" No. At this stage, the Bailey was getting beat up by 8-inch shells. She had no torpedoes left, and there really wasn't anything more they could do. So the range was starting to expand even more, and it was only a matter before the Japanese ships had steamed completely out of range and continued heading west. So through the smoke, Sock McMorris saw that the fleet was retiring, informs Admiral Kincaid that the enemy is retiring to the west, and Kincaid signals back, "Your task group has scored a signal victory. Well done." Next slide, please. Why the hell did Hosagaya turn away? In this diagram, you see the entire battle. You see how it started towards the east, progressed to the south, and pretty much continued on with both fleets paralleling each other. But at 12:04, you see the Japanese ceasefire and head due west, while the Americans keep going due south. And the Salt Lake City was dead in the water at 11:54, and the Japanese ceased fire at 12:04, 10 minutes later. Yeah, they were preoccupied in shooting at the destroyers, but they had the Americans on the ropes. And although they were obscured by smoke, with the wind gusts and the weather of the Aleutian, it was only a matter of time before it was going to be gone. So instead of resting on their laurels, it was generally considered that the Americans get the hell out of there, to borrow the words of some members of the Salt Lake City crew. So with caution being the better part of bravery, before you knew it, the Salt Lake City had steam up once again, and they proceeded to leave. And that was the end of the fight. So again, why? And this isn't the first time we would ask something of a Japanese admiral just on the cusp of victory, they turn away. So next slide, please. So when we're in World of Warships and we're sitting there blazing away, full DACA, what you're seeing right here is the results of a Pensacola-class cruiser shooting for 3.5 hours straight her entire load of ammunition. Armor piercing, high capacity, the works. And you can see the heat scaling, the pitting. I mean, these were brand new barrels when the battle started. And yeah, but also to let you know how awful the weather is, you can also see on the right-hand side that it's snowing when this picture is taking place. So the Salt Lake City altogether fired over 800 AP shells and 26 HE shells. Richmond fired 271 6-inch shells. The Coquelin fired 750 shells, the Bailey 482, and the Monaghan and the Dale both had over 500. So the Americans wasted no time in blazing away with everything that we had. But again, the Japanese had to have realized that the Americans were on their last legs. The Salt Lake City was saving the very last bits of its ammo for a last stand before the ship would inevitably go down. And while the Japanese, of course, were probably in the exact same situation, they had been firing just as long, just as hard. They had to have come to the realization that, things were going well for them and not necessarily for the Americans. So what changed Hosagaya's mind to make him think that the cautious route was the best way to go and to just disengage? Well, this battle took place on March 26th, and something happened before then that may have colored his mind. This is just my personal opinion. That same month, you had the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which was pretty much the first time in history where a coalition air power was able to not only sink enemy ships, but annihilate an entire resupply convoy. And he was very concerned about American air power in the area. Now, with low-lying clouds and the Salt Lake City switching from armor-piercing to high-capacity, high-explosive shells, at extreme range, these shells would come in at a very high incline through the clouds and explode on contact with high explosive filler. And many historians have posited that he thought that he was being bombed from under the clouds and that American air power had arrived and it was time for him to leave. With the thoughts of Bismarck Sea, in the background. He was low on fuel, he was low on ammo, and now apparently under attack by aircraft. So it's generally considered the reasons why he turned away and let the Americans get away. But more importantly, the Salt Lake City was already back to 25 knots and disappeared beyond the horizon. So we still would have had a bit of fight left. However, even if Hosogai wanted to come back and duke it out, the Americans were already back up to speed and leaving the area. Next slide, please. So the aftermath. The Nashi was a very good. The Bailey was hit twice with 8-inch shells, did extensive damage, and personally, I've held pieces of Japanese shrapnel that has been embedded like that. It was very popular amongst American crews to not only fix battle damage but search all over for souvenirs that they could take home and show their friends. Obviously, next slide, please. Case in point, this is on the Salt Lake City. You had shrapnel come right on through the hang. Any shell that hit. So, sailors will always be sailors. Next slide, please. So here you see the Salt Lake City repairing her wounds and burying her dead. Overall casualties, the Americans had 7 killed and 20 wounded. The Japanese had 14 killed and 26 wounded. But no ships were permanently damaged or sunk in this battle. And you got to ask yourself, all right, if this is such a key battle and such an important battle, why is this so important if the enemy didn't receive any ending damage and the Americans ran away just as fast as the Japanese did? Well, the important thing to remember is that this was going to be the 5th resupply convoy to Attu and Kiska. Those transports turned around and went right back to Japan with Hosagaya. Attu and Kiska were not resupplied, and the Japanese gradually began to understand that maybe their position in these godforsaken islands was untenable. Yeah, next slide, please. Sorry. So the lives of the ships afterwards. Well, the Maya and the Nashi were both lost in 1940. Maya was lost to the Nashi to aircraft. This is a very, very popular picture of the Nashi shortly before she sunk. You can see that her bowels has been blown off as well as her stern, and she's gradually sinking by the stern. Bad way to go. But with regards to the rest of the Japanese fleet, not one of them survived the war. None of the 4 DDs, none of the 2 light cruisers, none of the 2 heavy cruisers. In fact, the Hatsushimo, ended up being the last Japanese destroyer sunk in the war by a mine after the operation with the Yamato in 1945. And she was the 129th Japanese destroyer lost in the war. Next slide. The life of the Salt Lake City immediately after. She survived both aerial. She survived to the end of the war, earned 11 battle stars, and was used as a test ship for both the Able and Baker shots of Operation Crossroads. And she survived both the aerial and subsurface blasts. And she ended up becoming used as just a generic surface target during operations. It's a sad way to go, but at this point, the Americans had tons of Clevelands, they had tons of Baltimores, the Des Moines were on the horizon. There was no need to keep these ships around, no matter how much service that they had provided to their country. Next slide, please. Oh, and it's not even bothering worth mentioning, but yeah, the Omahas, they were all, and the only one to survive into 1947 was the Murmansk ex Milwaukee. If we were eager to get rid of the Pensacola's, we were even more eager to get. The USS Monaghan, unfortunately, was lost with very heavy loss of life during Typhoon Cobra. On the left-hand side, you can see what a typhoon looks like in 1944 radar. And if you see a light carrier rolling that bad, just imagine how terrible it had to be on board the Monaghan with empty fuel tanks rolling so heavily that she downflooded through her smokestacks. It's a rough way to go, and about a quarter of her crew survived that debacle. Next, please. So, the final outcome, well, the Japanese could no longer resupply their men stuck on that godforsaken island, and the Americans go. But no further attempts were made to resupply Attu or Kiska with transport ships, and it ended Japanese naval supremacy in the North Pacific. They never came out with a large force like that again in the North Pacific. It got to the point where we could send Omaha-class cruisers to do shore bombardments of, the Paramushiros without threat of Japanese surface units interfering. So we landed in the Battle of Attu on May 11th, about 2 months after the Battle of the Komandorski Islands, and it was an absolute bloodbath. And it gave very good. It was a good view of exactly what future combat was going to be like with the Japanese. But also, with this battle taking place after Guadalcanal, the Japanese realized that there was no shame in getting their people out of there while they could, and they evacuated Kiska of all their troops and pulled them back. They, like Guadalcanal, they did a very good job keeping this secret. When the Americans and Canadians landed on Kiska, they had no idea that the Japanese weren't there anymore. And as a result, we suffered about a little over 300 casualties due to booby traps, but mostly due to friendly fire. And I did not put a slide up here with the, but safe to say, Sock McMorris's reputation was tarnished, and he ended up being the chief of staff to the Pacific Fleet and one of Admiral Nimitz's closest friends and advisors. Admiral Hosogai, on the other hand, was ridiculed and generally slammed very, very, very hard for his conduct of the battle. He was forcibly retired, and he ended up becoming the governor of the South Seas Mandate for a little over a year until the war's end, or there wasn't anything left in the South Seas Mandate to govern. So, but both men did survive the war. And with that being said, thank you guys very much for sitting in. I know, but it's rare that you find a battle with ship classes that can be found in a great video game that we all, and not one ship was sunk, yet it determined the fate of the entire theater of the Pacific War. So thank you guys for your kind attention.
We have a quick second if anybody wants to ask any questions, if there's anything you guys want to know. Going once, twice.
Yeah, hold on. Blue Falcon.
Hey, there he is.
Yeah, let me just preface this. I'm no jingle. Answer it as best.
I gotcha. What was the intel that Task Force Mike had on the opposing force prior to going in? If you did say it, I missed it.
No, I didn't. The best intel they had was not to expect heavy cruisers, destroyers, or maybe a token cruiser.
Duke, you cut out a little bit there for me. Can you say that one more time?
Oh, sorry. Is this better?
So far, yes.
Okay. This was the fourth resupply mission. It was his job to cut off the fifth, and Sock McMorris went into the sortie expecting perhaps a light cruiser or two escorting destroyers that were carrying cargo and transport ships. He wasn't expecting the heavy cruisers, and but at the same time, even if he did know of the heavy cruisers, I guarantee he'd gone forth anyway. We operated the Aleutians campaign on a shoestring budget, And if you weren't going to fight, what's the point? One thing that the Americans did try to figure out as far as intel goes was why the hell didn't the Japanese destroyers get into the fight? I mean, they had just as many destroyers as we did. They had much better torpedoes than we did. Why weren't they doing anything? And the best we could figure, because the Japanese sources either don't exist or haven't been translated yet, the Americans just assumed that the Japanese destroyers were carrying cargo and troops as well.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Duke. Thanks so much for doing this for one. But it's interesting that that was like a real life YOLO in order to save the Salt Lake City. That's crazy. I
Yeah,
can't even imagine what that would have been like.
yeah, it would have definitely been a brown trouser moment.
Yeah.
It's not without precedent because you had the death ride of the battle. Later on, you had the battle off Samar, where light units would more or less sacrifice themselves to save the heavier units. That's just how it went. But to be honest with you, there's no better way to buy time or sow dissension in a battle line than to launch a bunch of torpedoes into their midst and give them something else to shoot at while the heaviest unit in your fleet is desperately trying to get back underway.
Any other questions?
All right, guys. Again, thank you for letting me do it. I'm sure I made mistakes here or there. I'm more than you want to. Obviously, I didn't just pull all this knowledge out of thin air. Source materials that have been invaluable, and most of the pictures did come from Navy History and Heritage Command. So, if you guys want to do any further research, I welcome it. And if you guys want to correct me, please shoot me a note.
I will mention I forgot to put a slide in here. There is a short bibliography of relevant reading material if anybody wants to read more about this. I have that, and of course, Duke has it as well. If you're interested in the further reading, just send me a DM. I'll be happy to send you the list, and all of them are available on Amazon. All right, folks. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much to Duke for putting this on. It was, for me, it was thrilling. I hope we'll find more ways to do historical presentations of this stuff because I think it just enriches the entire game experience. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck with the last night of clan battles. I know we're having a party over here tonight, so enjoy the rest of your afternoon and various sports and in the last day of the weekend. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
There's some cocaine tonight, kids.
And thank you to Vague.
That's not the party. What?
Oh. And thank you to Vague for recording this as well, since mine was acting up this afternoon while we were setting up.
I got duped. You guys told me there were cocaine and hookers tonight. Damn it. All right. Thanks, Llama, for organizing it. Duke for actually doing it.